with the end of Ripley, there's no point in still investigating that storyline without her.
I was stunned.
It's not a good idea to make sequels.
The soul of the piece is her finding out that she's still strictly human.
We read their script and we thought, well, this is just going to ruin this franchise.
After the disappointing returns and reception of Alien 3, the companies behind the series, Fox and Brandywine, would push forward on a script for Alien 4.
The company sent me here to show you a friendly face.
What guarantee do I have? Once you've taken it out, that you'll destroy it.
You have to trust me.
They would hire Joss Whedon, who was an up-and-coming name at the time, to write the script and try to come up with how to pull off a resurrection. Continuity with the past Alien films was a problem, given that Alien 3 had killed off all of the characters from the original 2 films. Of the survivors of Aliens, 3 of the characters, Newt, Hicks, and Bishop, were unceremoniously killed off-screen at the start of the film, while Ripley dies at the end, sacrificing herself to prevent the Weyland-Yutani Corporation from getting their hands on a chestburster she's carrying that they plan to use to breed more xenomorphs. The initial pitch involved Newt being cloned many years after the events of the original trilogy, with Whedon being seen as a good candidate to write for it because of his work on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, seemingly making him an expert for an action project with a teenage girl as the lead.
I got involved with Alien when Jorge Saralegui at Fox wanted very much to revive the franchise, and he knew my work and thought, that maybe I could write a treatment that would interest the brass. So I did. I wrote a treatment.
But after Whedon got 30 pages into the treatment for the film, they decided they wanted Ripley back instead.
And they said, this is interesting. We'd like maybe to make this, but you have to put Sigourney Weaver in it. Because originally she had been dead.
Walter Hill and David Giler, though, from Brandywine, pushed back heavily on making this film, with Giler saying, "We tried to stop them from making it." They developed the script on their own.
We opposed Alien 4, actually, Walter and I. We tried to stop them from making. They developed the script on their own from an idea that was kind of ours. But I told Sigourney at the Alien 3 party, she said, it feels kind of bad to be out of this movie completely, out of the franchise. What are you talking about? I can see them going to a drawer and pulling out some old fingernails and cloning you in your back. Don't worry about it. Oh yeah, she's okay.
The original idea was that the film would lead towards Earth, with the premise being that the ship the film was set on, the Auriga, would drift to Earth with the xenomorphs on board, leading to a battle for the planet as they invade the surface. Devising 5 different endings with this in mind, but then the studio decided to scrap this concept, with the drift towards Earth becoming a plot device that gets resolved without the climactic battle. These clunky changes led the film to be described as a personal Vietnam for Whedon, while Giler and Hill thought the film was a disaster for the franchise that shouldn't have been made.
We read their script and we thought, well, this is just going to ruin this franchise. This just doesn't work at all. They insisted on making it. They went ahead. They have Alien 4. They have theirs, we have ours.
But one person that was enthusiastic about it was Sigourney Weaver, who enjoyed the idea of an Alien/Ripley hybrid and what it could bring to her as a character.
I was afraid that Sigourney would say, can't we make her pretty and likable, and can she have a puppy? And she just kept saying, push it further. What if I'm even stranger? What if I have more alien and less human in me?
I was quite seduced by it. The fact that Winona had already committed to it, everything but the director was sort of there like a year before we started shooting.
Initially, Danny Boyle was the first choice to direct the film, but he decided to turn the project down and take on another production, A Life Less Ordinary, feeling that he wouldn't be right for the role, especially considering the special effects involved. Peter Jackson was approached to direct the film but refused, saying he just couldn't get interested in the Alien franchise. Bryan Singer went to Fox and asked for a sci-fi project to work on, so he was initially given the film, but he also rejected it in favor of working on X-Men. Lastly, they reached out to the French director Jean-Pierre, who was approached because of his unique visual style.
It was shortly thereafter that we met Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and just immediately had a real strong feeling that this is a guy that could pull this off. From having seen Delicatessen was the only film I was familiar with at the time that he had done, and knowing that he has such a such a specific visual style, and I think that's what the studio was so excited about, having him involved. It was going to be a whole different take, on the Alien series, to go in with that kind of vision as opposed to what had been done before.
Jeunet was surprised to be offered the film, as he thought the Alien franchise had been wrapped up after the third film and believed that making a sequel was a bad idea, saying, "I didn't want to make a big Hollywood movie, but it was interesting to go to the meeting, and I said, why do you want to hire me when there are so many good directors? Leave me alone, just leave me alone."
I remember I thought it's not a good idea to make sequels. And when they called me, I thought it's finished, the series finished now.
But the studio was excited by the fact he was not a Hollywood-style director. They hired me. I was so pissed off. But he ultimately asked himself, how could I say no to Alien, and decided to go for it, accepting the project with a budget of $70 million. Even after the director of Alien 3, David Fincher, called him up and said, "Give up, go back to Paris. Alien 3 was a nightmare." Jeunet would also take an interpreter along with him, since the English language wasn't exactly his strong suit at the time. He also opted to make the film a dark comedy and was encouraged to include more violence and get rid of some of Joss Whedon's generic action, saying Joss Whedon is very good at making films for American geeks. Something for morons.
I spent some time refining the script and figuring out what the climax was going to look like. And of course, he brought his jean-pierre-ness to it.
He would put together a team including French special effects supervisor Pitoff and cinematographer Darius Khondji to help realize this vision.
He basically had brought over some of his key players from France. He had Darius Khondji, who's a cinematographer who shot Seven at the time, and Stealing Beauty. He's a fantastic cinematographer. There was Pitoff, who's the special effects director, supervisor, I guess, from Dubois, with his whole French crew.
The deal with Fox and Jean-Pierre was to give to Jean-Pierre anything he needed to do his job and to be comfortable with his crew.
He initially wanted to bring in H.R. Giger, the original designer of the Xenomorph, to help with the film, but the studio refused, reportedly unhappy with his contributions in Alien 3. At the beginning, said the director, I thought this film would be a bit too difficult for me. It was my goal to just survive Hollywood and make the film, because for a French director, making a film in Hollywood is a dream and a nightmare at the same time. So it was very reassuring for me to work with Darius. After I started to work on Alien, though, I discovered that making a major American studio picture involved pretty much the same procedures that I had used in France. Together they watched the latest science fiction and Alien films as a reference, as well as obtaining production reports from the Alien films to study the camera setups. Jean-Pierre and I watched an incredible number of films, said Khondji. I was actually very interested in B-movies, especially the science fiction films of the 50s. Although they're not always well done, they can be almost haunting. That element was very important to me for Alien Resurrection because I wanted the film to feel haunted. I wanted the sets and the ship to be haunted by the evilness of the characters within them. Alien Resurrection would begin its production at Fox Studios in California in October 1996, making it the first Alien film to be made outside of England. Given that it is a French director and the eternal love between the English and the French, you'd think that was the cause of not filming in England. Am I right? But in reality, it was Sigourney Weaver who was probably still a little upset about how things turned out in the last production, and thought that the previous travel schedule just exhausted the crew.
All the pictures have been really hard to do. They've all been rough. In England, especially where we always did them, we worked till like 11 o'clock every night, and we worked Saturdays, and it was really lousy. We made good movies, but I don't like to see the crew exhausted. I think it's dangerous for this kind of movie.
Jeunet actually had difficulty securing studio space because there were several large productions that were ongoing at the same time, namely Titanic, Starship Troopers, and The Lost World, Jurassic Park, were all productions that took up tons of studio space at that time.
And I remember it was a funny story. The Fox studio weren't available because the wife of Robert Murdoch wanted to make a charity sale in a stage. And at the end, we got the stages.
Now, filming this new iteration of Alien would prove to be a little difficult. What is usual for each alien is the xenomorphs have some new form of movement. For the first film, it was creeping and stalking. For the second, their movement sped up, and for the third film, it was crawling on all fours and sprinting across the room. For Alien Resurrection, the xenomorphs were aquatic, which meant they would be seen swimming around, which led to questions being asked on just how can this be visualized?
We discovered at first we needed a rather large tank to fit several of our sets in, which was really bigger than what was available in Los Angeles. We thought we might have to go down to San Diego for it.
To get started, they would have to actually convert Stage 16 at Fox Studios into a massive 36 by 45 meter tank.
They converted an entire soundstage, which is vast, into this big swimming pool, and then dressed it as if it were a kitchen that was flooded.
We had several discussions about the lighting and how much you could see underwater, explained Kanji. We wanted to have the freedom to shoot the chase almost in a choreographed manner with 2 underwater cameras, so I decided to utilize overhead lighting, making shafts of light using virtually no fill at all and underexposing a lot.
I actually designed the lighting of the underwater with, always with the input of my underwater cameraman, Peter Romano.
Darius was really into fluorescent lighting, and my little widget shop here came up with our first underwater fluorescence, which I'm not sure that this is 100%, but I believe, at least for me, in terms of Hollywood and what's going on, was the first time underwater fluorescents were specifically put in the water.
Shooting underwater is a difficult and at times dangerous affair, which is cumbersome for not just the actors, but also the crew. But now just imagine you're wearing a massive, bulky xenomorph suit that will drag you down and hinder your movement underwater, and you have to, meanwhile, act out the agile and elegant movements of your typical xenomorph. Sounds not so fun, right? Well, it was unrealistic to get a creature actor suited up and take a dive for hours on end on shooting day. And you likely know where this is going. In this movie, digital effects really come into play. But this in no way was an out for the actors on set. They would have to swim the pool for extended periods of time and do everything mostly underwater, which meant that a reliable air supply had to be brought to them. Whenever the actors needed to refuel on oxygen, they would go slightly out of shot, breathe from a mouthpiece that is connected to an oxygen tank, shoot the scene, and then go back on oxygen right after.
When they would yell cut, you are now completely out of air and, completely depleted of energy, and you need oxygen immediately. They're down there with tanks on their backs with an extra hookah and an extra mouthpiece, and they would be there. You couldn't see them. You'd swim, and they would stop you, grab you, and put the mouthpiece in your mouth. We did that for 4 weeks. At first, it was terrifying. At first, it was the scariest thing ever.
Shooting underwater was also somewhat difficult, with the directors not being directly present with the crew. They were giving orders from outside where they would also monitor the set. Simply put, communication was really key for these scenes.
If you have a good communication between the underwater and the above water station, where the director is, sometimes the DP or all the crew, the rest of the crew, and the electrician and all that, and the underwater. If you have a good communication, it goes more smoothly and you can achieve more and more interesting shots.
Then there's another consideration. Remember in Avatar 2, for that movie, the tanks that the actors were swimming in were basically mocap studios. They were big, empty, unroofed, and thus relatively safe for the actors to traverse. For Alien Resurrection, underwater sets were built. That means that debris was all around. Various obstacles, walls, scrap metal, etc. Added to all of this, the actors were not able to wear scuba gear. They had to wear their own costumes, carry their own props, and that's an environment which, while controlled, was filled with potential dangers and obstacles.
It was complicated by the fact that it was a closed set, meaning we had ceilings overhead. Also, we had quite a number of actors who were not scuba certified. Some were, some weren't. But that also, adds a degree of safety and confusion to what would be happening.
To make matters worse, one of the actors for the film, Winona Ryder, had not been in a body of water since she had almost drowned at the age of 12.
I was about 12 years old and I nearly drowned, and I had to be resuscitated and everything, so I hadn't gone underwater since then. Because I had really short hair, there was I mean, there wasn't a lot of stuff that a double could do because you really see my face. So I realized I was really gonna have to do it.
The pressure to get everything right and everything done safely was on the shoulders of the actors as well as the safety staff. The stars had to take extensive scuba diving sessions and learn how to swim and control themselves underwater. If something happened in the pool, they're in definite danger as they can't just swim up to the surface to take a quick breath.
Basically, it's a lot of sessions. I think we had 10 to 15 water safety sessions before we even got to this tank. Then once we're at this tank, we had about 2.5 weeks of training. And our dive master, who's a certified instructor, has led everybody through the process of basically scuba diving, but with much less time than your normal scuba diving course.
Swimming through the waters blind while performing for the camera and coordinating to not bump into each other, Alien Resurrection was especially tough on the cast. However, the people that were about to design and animate the xenomorph faced challenges of a far less deadly nature. Now, getting into VFX, for this film they would work with Blue Sky Studios.
They left without me. They do this every year. Why? Doesn't anyone love me? Isn't there anyone who cares about Sid the Sloth?
Yes, that Blue Sky. Blue Sky had a reputation at the time for being excellent animators and ones that were very influential in the CG sphere, making many advertisements, creating effects for movies, and also eventually being hired for Alien Resurrection.
For the CG, we select Blue Sky Studio in New York because they did this movie called Joe's Apartment.
It featured a lot of cockroaches, and the character animation that they got into some of those cockroaches is what impressed us the most.
In this movie, about 20 CG xenomorph shots were created, and those were predominantly the underwater scenes, which had challenges of their own, especially when it comes to rigging and animation. In a 3D VF interview with Steve Telkowski, he recalls that the alien was modeled in a software called
the Softimage 3D. From sand and sun to fire and rain, the new Softimage particle system gives you full command of real-world effects.
How the models were made is quite unconventional for today's standard. Instead of using polymodels, the artists instead used NURBS modeling. This meant instead of drawing the faces of an object with polygons to create a 3D mesh, you would make use of dozens of control points which manipulate the NURBS curves you are drawing. This modeling method is especially great for precise tasks such as industrial design, but it's also rather advantageous for organic shapes, which the xenomorphs have many of.
I remember it was a pain because they weren't polygons. There was like NURBS-based modeling. We did it in sections. That's how weird it was because the model was so heavy that we couldn't rig it up all at once. So we had to rig up in sections and then kind of piece it together.
This was also a time where inverse kinematic solutions were being introduced into 3D programs, where essentially multiple points of an arm, for instance, can be connected together and influence each other when one joint or bone in the structure is moved. This drastically sped up the animation process.
I wish we didn't have that back in Wavefront. I was doing some beta testing for Kinimation, which would later turn it up in Maya years later. I remember seeing Softimage at SIGGRAPH, and when that demo where they had the finger and they create a 3-joint skeleton and they put the end effector, and then I was like, what? Yeah, that was where I was like, I want to be working with that.
Before the artists could do their magic, however, a plan was needed in order to figure out what scenes require CG and which didn't. The script was the perfect jumping off point for the artists as it was specially designed to have a visual focus, with the left side of a page being illustrated with comic panel-like drawings and the right-hand side featuring dialogue.
How many scripts do you know that are constructed with the visuals attached to the actual text?
These scenes were then numbered in order to get an overview of which scenes needed what done and who exactly worked on them. Working with Blue Sky did bring about problems. Not problems in regards to quality of work, but rather problems that have to do with distance and time zones, which required newer methods in order to keep in touch and gather feedback.
There was something called sprint drums at the time, which is archaic now, but it was a way to have a camera on our end and a computer screen where we could see their animations, make comments on them, scroll on right onto the screen.
Another house handled the mechanical environments and structures in the film, working on all of the miniature composites that can be seen in Alien Resurrection.
Jean-Pierre and I, of course, we know very well Dubois, so we are very comfortable with them.
They ended up compositing all the miniature shots with
backgrounds and star fields.
And even though the age of digital cameras wasn't quite there yet, in a way, Alien Resurrection's creation resembled a modern production style much closer than what Boss Studios did for Alien 3. A bigger emphasis on digital assets, a decentralized international team which collaborated over the internet, and many more digital fusions between physical and virtual props. There's much more to Alien Resurrection's special effects than digitally creating swimming xenomorphs. We also have a fair share of practical effects, which not only look real, but are absolutely disgusting. And what makes Alien Resurrection so impressive, or maybe its fault, depending on who you ask, from a production standpoint, is that we have a lot of different monster designs that range from various levels of complexity, from intricate makeup work to puppets and animatronics. The prop masters for this film were Amalgamated Dynamics, who are experts in creating special effects of many kinds. They were responsible for gory death scenes, creepy makeup, and even creepier remote-controlled animatronic rigs, which had an impressive range of motion with fully articulable fingers and even a moving tongue. In this early test footage, we can see just how this effect works. The head burster is attached to a string, and the head itself is a remote-controlled animatronic. Further tests became increasingly more disgusting, with the blood color changing to red and the head burster model becoming more and more detailed. With incremental improvements to props, we eventually end up with a surprisingly realistic-looking scene.
So the creature just looks like more of a pulpy kind of a larval stage of a living creature. It's much more alive looking. We've articulated it to a degree that it's very squirmy, it's very alive, and trying to get the most impact. So as it's bursting out of its host, maybe you're seeing something different, but maybe it's just a subconscious thing that you're feeling that it's a very live, living creature.
For animatronic work, we have two big examples to showcase: the newborn hybrid and the alien queen. This time around, animatronics were built to scale, meaning that the newborn animatronic and the queen's head were as big as they would have been in the universe.
There's a sudden, different kind of awareness to it when you first see it, it looks very alien-like, but as it's looking at you, you suddenly realize it's got a whole new dimension to it, something that you haven't seen, and it almost, in many ways, it's what people say makes the alien even scarier, because now it has eyes.
Moving the puppets or animatronics around was also rather interesting. A group of people would push the puppet forward, controlling the arms, legs, and torso, and while that is cumbersome, it really paid off in the end. This time around, even the monsters had something to fear. Though this is the part where Joss Whedon would start to separate himself from the film, saying, "I don't remember writing a withered, granny-looking pumpkin head kinda thing makes out with Ripley. I think it's kind of sexy and weird," says Junet. They almost make love. It was very disturbing to American people. You know how they are Puritan. And arguably, the newborn hybrid had it the worst in the end. And it's probably the saddest and most violent passing that can be observed in Alien Resurrection. The creature is sucked out of the vessel from a crack in one of the ship's windows and is torn apart, piece by piece, in the process. Surprisingly, this was mostly done using practical effects work. Action! We can again see just how these effects were built from the ground up by observing what Amalgamated Dynamics had done in their test recordings. To make the hybrid model look like it's getting sucked out of the craft, its belly bursts with the guts falling out of the cavity and then promptly being pulled back in. The skin gets pulled into the skull, and finally a different, fragmented skull model gets pulled to make it cave in and crumble into itself. Where the CG comes in is when the debris gets flung out into space. Those bony and fleshy bits are done digitally. Alien Resurrection was definitely a saucier film when compared to its predecessors, or rather Fox thought so, especially when it comes to one particular prop. This uncomfortable looking puppet of a Ripley clone is interestingly built. The humanoid form is animated by someone sitting under the table, using levers, with the actor's head poking out of the top, while the body is hidden beneath. What makes this prop and the hybrid newborn model so unpopular with higher-ups at Fox, however, is its depiction of odd hybrid genitalia.
The genitals of the newborn was a whole issue. Jean-Pierre was very much adamant that it should have genitals, and that the genitals should look like a cross between male and female. So we came up with something that accomplished that, looked appropriately disgusting. And but at one point he came back to us. The studio was always very uncomfortable with it, and he was sort of, you know, holding them off a little bit.
As a comment from Amalgamated Dynamics reads, yeah, all of our on-set footage showed the penis and vagina since it was there in the build. It was only after shooting that Fox blurred the sweet spots in at least one of the shots. It's kind of strange, right? I mean, in an ultra-violent space adventures that shows everything from heads exploding, dismemberment, and a sentient half-human, half-alien being sucked out of a pinhole into space, they drew the line at oddly shaped fictional, lab-grown crown jewels. But oddly enough, even the French director thought it was too much, saying, "Even for a Frenchman, it is too much." Production would wrap up in February 1997. It would release first in France in 1997 and would top the box office there until opening in the US on November 26, 1997. In the US, though, they had another green monster they had to contend with at the box office. As far as the final box office total at $161.4 million, it probably meant that the film broke even. And as the director said, not a disaster, but almost. But others like Roger Ebert would call it one of the worst films of 1997. Regardless of what you think of the film itself, it is usually regarded as a film that stalled the franchise, and it ended with further bickering between the director and Joss Whedon. Joss Whedon was surprised that they followed to his original script fairly closely, but said that with a caveat. It was mostly a matter of doing everything wrong. They said the lines, mostly, but they said them all wrong. And they cast it wrong, and they designed it wrong, and they scored it wrong. They did everything wrong that they could possibly do. It wasn't so much that they changed the script, it's that they just executed it in such a ghastly fashion as to render it almost unwatchable. Later on, Jeunet would comment back at Whedon saying, "I know Joss Whedon said some bad things about me. I don't care. I know if Joss Whedon had made the film himself, it probably would have been a big success. He's very good at making films for American geeks, something for morons, because he's very good at making Marvel films. I hate this kind of movie. It's so silly, so stupid." And it's with this bickering that the franchise seemed to be over and had run out of any creative steam to continue it. Until two former Alien directors, Ridley Scott and James Cameron, started looking into a prequel that would eventually turn into the film Prometheus 15 years later. And you can check that video out right here.